Here in part 4, let's begin to explore the evidence for when life began. We don't have the luxury of being able to look back 2, 3, 4 million, much less 10 million, much less a billion years to see high-resolution fossils that are very similar to what we see on Earth today. So instead, we turn to geological signs, geological information that helps us discover life. The earliest life is not recorded in fossils. Instead, it's recorded in isotopes, that is, carbon isotopes of rock carbonates that we'll find on different layers. Here, as you see, the strata laid down sequentially over time. So at this point here, let's begin to pull out the geological timescale, because that's the book, the layers that we're going to look at to begin to reconstruct the history of life on Earth. We know that Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago, or 4,540 million years ago, and here we are today. So 12% of the history of Earth passed before the Earth cooled enough that life could begin. And at about the 15% point, about 3.7 billion years ago, we think life began. So we will be coming back to this graph, this chart, again and again. Most of us don't spend much time thinking about the Hadean or the Archean or the Proterozoic. When we think of fossils, we often think of what's happened in the last 10% of Earth's history. The Paleozoic, the Mesozoic with the reptiles, and the Cenozoic with the rise of mammals. But this is an extremely interesting period in Earth's history, and we have evidence that life began 3.7 billion years ago. And that evidence is in the form of rocks and carbonates. So here in B, you see a cross-section of a rock that was found in southwestern Greenland. And the scientists have put markers on here to help you understand the shapes that you're seeing above. We think this is a fossil stromatolite. We'll talk about what that is in a second, but it's a form of life with waves going up and down in a matrix of carbonates. So how do we know that this is life? Well, the earliest life is not recorded in fossils, but it's recorded in the carbon isotopes. And in the pre-class materials, you were given a brief introduction as to what isotopes are. So isotopes are different forms of the same element, simply differing in the number of neutrons. And it turns out that if carbon dioxide comes from air and it interacts with water to form a bicarbonate, which then precipitates with calcium to form calcium carbonate, we can tell the difference in whether that carbon dioxide came from air or whether it came from respiration associated with biology. So it turns out that the amount of 13C over 12C in that carbonate rock preserves a signal of whether that carbon dioxide was formed geologically from air or biologically from respiration. As was mentioned in the pre-class materials, isotopes represent simply different forms of the same atom. If we have 6 protons and 6 neutrons for a mass of 12, we have carbon 12. If we have one more neutron, 6 and 7 makes 13. And as you recall, an element is defined on the basis of the number of protons, and often, but not always, there's a number of neutrons that's equal to the number of protons. In this case here, if we look at the concentration of 13C to 12C, if it has a value of 0.01130, it was formed from a geological process. If it has a value equal to 0.01095, it's formed from a biological process. Now, while these numbers seem really close to each other, it turns out that we can measure with high precision the abundance of 13C to 12C using a device called a mass spectrometer. Up on the 5th floor of Skaggs Biology, we have 7 isotope ratio mass spectrometers. Students are free to come in and work on with projects. And with that, we can look at isotopes of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, chlorine, and sulfur associated with different biological processes. So let's get back to the fossil stromatolite that we have from Greenland. When they began to tear apart and look at the different parts of this carbonate rock, what they found was that this section here had carbon isotope values consistent with the biological process. So respiration was the likely source of the CO2 that was then preserved as a carbonate. Whereas above and below that was a carbon isotope ratio consistent with the geological process. And this then becomes our first evidence of when life began. So this would have indicated that we had a fully functional organism by that time, capable of carrying out respiration, which could then be condensed through processes to form carbonates. We call those stromatolites. We can find stromatolites today. So here you see in the shallow intertidal zone a stromatolite, which can then be sectioned. And what you see here are layers, and those are layers in which the cyanobacteria are active, or they die, and we have carbonate formation from geological processes. So this is a sequence of life active, life not active. So biological, geological, biological, geological, over time as sea level changes occurred. So we could look at that and reconstruct the history of life, which is what we did with that Greenland fossil. You can actually see these stromatolites here in Utah. Here's a picture taken from Buffalo Point, which is here in the northwest corner of Antelope Island. So if you simply drive over to Antelope Island and go to the parking lot and simply hike over the hill, you'll be able to see these stromatolites. Remnants of what life was like 3,700 million years ago. As I mentioned earlier, the history of life is recorded as chapters. We call those chapters geological periods. And you might ask yourself, well, what defines the end of one chapter and the beginning of the next? It's usually a catastrophic event. Something happens at the end of each chapter, and the result is a tremendous loss of biodiversity and the creation or the emergence of new life. There are many things that could happen. We know now of a number of things that could happen that cause these big catastrophic changes in biological diversity. One of the ones that's the most famous occurred about 65 million years ago when a large meteorite crashed into what is now the Caribbean, and that put us into a state of nuclear winter. That is when it was dark and there was no primary productivity, and the result was a tremendous loss of biodiversity, including the loss of all dinosaurs. So if the end of the geological period is associated with a big reduction in biodiversity, the beginning of a geological period is always associated with the emergence of a new life group that now begins to dominate that wasn't there before. And for the group discussion, we're going to ask you to take your information prior to today and develop a word cloud of 2 possible events that could lead to the end of a geological period.